Do we have a mic?
Thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to welcome all those who are here in the hall live and also those who are joining us online. We're very pleased to be able to have our party leader with us this evening, and I hope that you're all looking forward to hearing her. First, I will introduce myself. My name is Naomi Rankin. I am the part of the Communist Party candidate in Edmonton. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what's happened in the campaign so far. We haven't done a lot of door-to-door. This is going to be an unusual campaign, and we're going to be trying to get the maximum exposure for our ideas and the maximum communication with the voters with the minimum physical contact. So we don't expect that we're going to do much actual door knocking. But to the extent that we have already talked to people, that we have knocked on a few doors, we have met people out on the street, I have to say that I find in this election campaign that there's a real uptick in positive acceptance of our party. The number of times when a person's face lights up when we tell them that we're the candidate for the Communist Party is increasing. And I think Liz will talk to you this evening about what's really going on with capitalism and socialism. I think in a way that will help to explain that. But I just would say one other thing about the reason that we chose to run in Edmonton is because there is actually a high proportion of immigrant communities there. And we know that from the diversity of experience of people coming from all over the world, that we expect in the long run that these are going to be very important connections for us to make, very important allies for us in the struggle for socialism in Canada. So before we bring this up to the podium, I would also like to introduce this evening our candidate in Edmonton Griesbach, Alex Boykovich. Alex?
Thanks, Naomi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Ukrainian Center. My name is Alex Boykovich. I'm proud to be, once again, the Communist Party of Canada candidate in Edmonton Griesbach. Thanks to the many dozens of electors who signed the consent forms to get me on the ballot. Thanks to the many more who expressed their support but couldn't sign because they live outside the riding, because they are permanent residents not entitled to vote. Thanks to the comrades who worked to get us on the ballot in Edmonton Griesbach. It must be said that no one wanted this election, including myself. No one, that is, except Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada. Why did they want it? To get a majority government for themselves instead of a minority. Why? to help workers and small property owners, the great majority of the people in Canada. There is no progressive measure in the interest of this great majority of the people in Canada that the Liberal minority government couldn't have passed with the support of other parties in Parliament, such as the NDP or the Bloc. There is no such measure that the Liberals couldn't have passed with the majority government they had previously. Why then? Not to benefit workers and small property owners, but to benefit big business, the monopoly capitalists. To make workers and small property owners, not big business, pay for the billions of dollars the state has had to spend during this pandemic. And to make us, not big business, pay for the necessary transition to the green economy. Prosperity for big business, austerity for workers and small property owners. That's what the Liberal Party of Canada stands for. And the Conservatives are even worse. The Liberals and the Conservatives are the two main parties of big business, monopoly capital in Canada. The Canadian people must break with this two-party system, with its artificially created majority governments, in which the Liberals and Conservatives take turns delivering billions to big business and empty promises to the people. So, what's the alternative? The nationalization of a single long-term care company, which is already state-owned, as proposed by the NDP, when the pandemic has exposed the absolutely shameless and even murderous treatment of seniors and the most vulnerable people in our society. The only real alternative is the platform of our party, the Communist Party of Canada. Adopt a full employment policy, enact a 32-hour week with no loss in take-home pay. Build 1 million units of affordable housing, social housing, including rental units, co-ops, and housing for sale. Raise the minimum wage to $23 an hour. Make EI non-contributory and accessible to all the unemployed for the full duration of unemployment and 90% of previous earnings. Substantially increase public pensions to a livable level with full benefits at 60. Enact a universally accessible, quality public child care system that's free to users. Expand Medicare to include pharmacare, long-term care, dental and vision care, and mental health care. Make post-secondary education free and fully fund post-secondary education institutions. Cancel student debt. Adopt an independent Canadian foreign policy of peace and disarmament. Get Canada out of NATO and NORAD. Cut military spending by 75%. Redirect it to social spending. Abolish the RCMP, CSIS, and the CSE. And much, much more. I call on all workers and small property owners all across Canada, including in Edmonton Roots Block, who want a future for themselves and for Canada to vote communist in this election. Support the platform and the program of the Communist Party of Canada. Join the Communist Party of Canada. The future can be ours if only we work together and make it so. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. You can see he's practicing now for when he takes his seat in Parliament. I would now like to bring our party leader to the podium to speak to you, Comrade Ms. Rowley. Many of you here in the hall I know have met her before. It's a long time since we've seen her in person, too long. So we're very pleased and excited that she's here with us in person today. But for those who have been following our party webinars and online meetings, public meetings, will not be a stranger to Liz either. They'll have gotten to know her even through the period of the pandemic. So without more ado, I'm going to invite Liz to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. And it's a pleasure to see you all. Some of you we've met before, and others it's meeting for the first time today. Better?
Yeah.
Okay. I said not too much. Well, listening listening a minute ago to Alex speak, it's a Naomi thing, speak, and made me think about what Parliament would look like if they were there on September 21st. And I think that you will probably agree with me that Parliament would not be the same place on the 21st of September with Naomi and Alex and there, and I'll go with them. And if we also took with us our comrade Jonathan Troutman from Calgary and maybe a few others. In fact, if we took all 26 communist candidates who are running for election across the country in this election and put them into Parliament, we could really change the face of Parliament and of government and of the way that people live in this country. And that's what we are asking voters to do in this election. We are saying that the best outcome would be another minority government. Because a minority liberal government, or majority liberal government, but God forbid a majority Tory government, would be a terrible outcome for working people. It would be very good for big business. It would be terrible for working people and for the unemployed. The best bet is the election of a minority government, but unlike the previous minority, we need to see a minority that's got a big, strong, progressive bloc that is going to fight for the kind of program, as Alex said, that we are fighting for in this election. This is a program for our people's recovery. We already have a corporate recovery. And in case there's any doubt about that, the figures show Statistics Canada that have been made public in the last couple of weeks show that in the first quarter of this year, so the first 3 months of this year, corporate profits increased by 18.1%. That is by $1.54 billion. I don't know of anybody who's had a wage increase of 18.1%, but if there's anybody here who has to, I'd like to see you. Anyone? No, I didn't think so. And in fact, a lot of people are about to lose the subsistence income that they have because next month, after the federal election is over, the CERB benefits that so many people have relied on for the last more than a year are going to be cut. And also the improvements that were made in December to the EI benefits that were paid, raising them to $500 a week, so that they would match the CERB benefits. They are also evaporating. And we will go back to EI payments and the amount of those payments that were in place before last year. And you know, you would think, listening to the Liberals and the Tories as well, to some degree the NDP, unfortunately, that we are on the verge of coming out of the crisis, the economic crisis that we have been in since just about the same time that the pandemic arrived. This economic crisis also arrived. And that when the pandemic passes, the economic crisis will also pass. But you know, it ain't so. This crisis has been coming for a long time. And if you read the business pages of the newspaper, you will know that the business interests, big business interests, we're talking for some months, actually many months before the crisis hit, about the fact that the rate of growth of the economy was falling and falling and falling, and that they were getting close to the no growth point. And the question was, when is the crisis actually going to hit? When is the recession going to hit? And how big a recession will it be? And it happened that it arrived at the same time as the pandemic. But the two are not connected. And while we very much hope that the pandemic will pass before too long, although there are indications that we're maybe not going to get past this pandemic as quickly as we had hoped we would earlier in the spring with the fourth wave that's coming. And the news from the medical people in this country that Canadians should get used to pandemics. Pandemics are going to be a feature of the world in the future. Nevertheless, the pandemic may indeed pass before this economic crisis passes. This is a big one, it's a deep one. And how bad it is has been revealed in the Stats Canada figures about the economy, what has happened to the economy so far this year, in 2021. Because, you know, at the beginning of this year, the Liberals and the Tories and the bourgeois newspapers and so on were all saying, well, we're in a period of recovery. Recovery now. The economy is growing, people are going back to work. We're going to be okay very soon. But the Stats Canada figures that have come out for the last couple of weeks have shown that not only have we not been growing, but there was a contraction in the economy last spring and also in July. And that things are, there is no signs of big growth ahead. And this is, in fact, there are 1 million people who are still out of work in Canada. So last year, at the height of the pandemic, there were 7 million people who applied for CERT benefits and EI benefits and so forth. And now it's down to 1 million. But those 1 million have no work. A lot of them who are working less than 50% of the hours that they worked before the crisis hit, and are no longer qualified for EI. Time has run out. Surveys are disappearing. And what are we seeing? What's the real situation in this election? Well, we know that there are an awful lot of people who are, as they were before the crisis, on the edge of catastrophe. Everything hinges on whether you have a job. And there was a study done before the economic crisis hit, in which more than half of those surveys said they were $200 away from economic catastrophe at the end of every month. That's how close to the edge they were. And it had to do with the debt levels caused by credit card debt, because so many people have been forced to put their basic necessities that they don't have the cash, they put them on the credit card. The credit card debt is growing very high. And then housing debt for people who have mortgages and who have bought houses and who are, because of the high cost of housing, the inflated cost of housing, people who are just on the verge. All it will take is any kind of an increase in interest rates, and a great many people are going to be walking away from their homes and have no equity in their homes, and life is going to get even more difficult for them than it is already. So what we are seeing in this election, so why did they call an election? Well, they misjudged. The Liberals misjudged. They thought that the economy was going to be in better shape by this time, and that people would be feeling like, well, we're coming out of it. The Liberals brought us out of it. The pandemic is going away. Let's give the Liberals a vote. But of course, as we know now, our things are going in the opposite direction. And the Tories are busy campaigning very hard. Suddenly, for the first time that I can remember, the Tories are the friends of workers. What a surprise. And this started last Labor Day, a year ago, when workers in this country got a message from O'Toole, telling them that he and the Tories are friends of workers, that they care about workers having good jobs and higher living standards and so on, and that people should give the Tories a try, and that the Liberals were the parties of big business and so on. The real kind of standing on extending it, So what is this rush for an election that they were so anxious to get? It's because the deficit that has been created as a result of the economic crisis over the last 17 months now stands at $381 billion. And big business is demanding that somebody's got to pay the freight. And they don't want it to be big business. They want it to be you and me too. And so they think they need a majority government. Liberal or Tory, it needs to be a majority government, which can implement the kind of austerity that big business is demanding. And if you look at what the Tories are saying, that's the recipe. And it's a recipe that the Liberals didn't want to deliver. That's why
their
election
election platform has been so late in coming out, because who's going to vote for a party which says, sorry, we have to cut CERB, we have to cut EI permanently, we have to cut social programs, we have to raise taxes, nobody's going to vote for that. So what the Tories are actually saying is that that's what they're going to do, but they're going to do it without making any cuts. So they're just, they think people are stupid, that you can cut costs, reduce this deficit, without raising taxes on big business and without putting the country back to work in a way that will create real value and kickstart the economy. So that's why they need a majority government, because whichever government brings in austerity, and both of them will, if they have a majority, and if they have a minority, they'll support each other in doing it. They know that people aren't going to vote for those kinds of policies. People are looking for a government which is going to put forward the kind of policies which we are advocating. And that's why we're getting the kind of very positive response that we have received since the beginning of this election campaign, and before that as well, when we've been campaigning for a people's recovery. And so what is a people's recovery? Well, we say that a people's recovery means that recovery is based on the country going back to work. People have to be going back to work in large numbers, to good jobs. We have to be seeing increased wages and rising living standards. And so that means creating jobs. I mean, real jobs. Now, we're not talking here about jobs in the retail industry or in the hospitality industry, which pay, minimum wage or less in some areas. We're talking about people going to work in areas like manufacturing and secondary industry, and expanded social programs. In the first place, in building housing. We all know that there's a housing crisis right across the country. It's a crisis of affordability. It's also a crisis of housing stock. And see, what we say the obvious thing to do is for the government to get directly into the housing business, like they did after World War II, and build 1 million units of affordable social housing across the country. And that would put at least 1 million workers to work, building that housing. First of all, in construction, right? But also in terms of, for every job in construction, there are 5 spin-off jobs. So that's the first thing. But in addition to that, for every house that's built, you're going to need appliances in that house. You're going to need furniture. You're going to need drapes. You're going to need dishes. All the things that will be needed that will require people to go to work in order to create those things, to make those things. So when we're talking about putting the country back to work, we're talking about creating real wealth here, not speculative wealth, which is what the Liberals and Tories are talking about. We also want to see an expansion of social programs. And the obvious ones are healthcare. Here we have 80% of the 26,000 people who've died as a result of COVID in this country have died in private for-profit long-term care homes and in some publicly funded homes that were publicly underfunded. And if you ask anybody in this country now, what do you think about private for-profit long-term care homes? They'll tell you they have to go. And indeed, they do have to go. The Romano Commission, which reported in the early 1990s, recommended a Medicare reform that would include long-term care, as well as pharmacare, so we're talking about drugs, and dental care and vision care. And we've added to that mental health care. And if there is a crisis in healthcare now, because of the way that nurses have been, and healthcare workers and frontline healthcare workers have been treated, a lot of nurses are just retiring, they're just getting out. And there's a massive shortage of nurses and not only nursing staff, but healthcare workers. And we, we need a government which is going to respect healthcare workers. And the first way to do that is to introduce 14 employer-paid sick days for frontline workers and for all workers in Canada, to pay the pandemic pay that they promised they would pay and very often have not paid in various parts of the country, to adequately fund Medicare across the country, and to, we say we should also be doing things like nationalizing the pharmaceutical industry, which is responsible for the death of many people in Canada, but also many people around the world as a result of their positions that profits are more important than people's lives. And we can see that around the question of the patents, that the pharmaceutical companies have refused to drop the patents so that people in Latin America, in India, in Africa, where death rates are very high from COVID, where those governments and those people can access the vaccines, the life-saving vaccines that would save their lives. So we say enough is enough. It's time to nationalize the pharmaceutical companies, set up publicly owned pharmaceutical industry in Canada that can do the research and that can produce the vaccines that are needed today and that will be needed in the future. We used to have a publicly owned pharmaceutical industry. It was small, but it was the Connaught Laboratories. And this was the pharmaceutical company that developed the Salt vaccine that ended the scourge of polio in this country, and not only in Canada, but beyond as well. So this is something that needs to be done. Why don't we do it? Because we don't have a government with the political will to do it. We have a government which is supported by pharmaceutical companies who want Canadian governments to continue to protect their profits and their drug-making abilities and patent abilities, not only in Canada, but around the world. So we should expand healthcare. And we should also expand public and post-secondary education. As Alex said earlier, there's no reason why students should have to pay tuition fees and carry enormous debts when they graduate from university. Why should they? If they have the marks, they should have access to universities. And the government should not, well, here's a figure that you may find useful. Not very long ago, federal governments paid 80% of the cost of post-secondary education in Canada. They now pay 30%. And that is why the university in Sudbury was facing bankruptcy proceedings, because they were unable to manage on the pitiful funding from the federal government that they were receiving. And so what do universities do in that situation? They go after the students. They milk the students with very high and constantly increasing tuition fees. And you don't want to know what they do to international students who are not Canadian citizens, but they pay 5-6 times the tuition that Canadian students pay. So this is a very bad thing. And instead of going after students, and instead of going begging to big corporations to ask them for big donations to universities, hospitals do the same thing. So that you go into any university, and the first wall that you see is apparently built through the gracious donations of this or that company. And everything in that university is named after some corporation or some corporate executive. Why? It's because our universities and post-secondary education are actually being privatized by stealth. That's what this is about. And that's the agenda that the Liberals and Tories have. But it's not the agenda that we have, and it's not the agenda that working people in this country want. We are a wealthy country. We have well-educated young people, and we should do everything that we can to make sure that when they have the ability and the interest and want to get strong post-secondary education, they should be able to do that. And that would also create jobs in those universities and for students coming out of those universities who would be able to do the jobs that require highly educated workforce. We have that in Canada, and we should nurture it. We should have a national childcare program. This is another obvious thing. Everybody knows that. And this was a promise that was made in 1993 by the Liberal government in their little red book. They promised a public system of national childcare, quality public childcare in Canada. Never delivered it. And I doubt that they're going to deliver on the one they're promising to deliver now. And you should know that the Tories are absolutely opposed to this program, limited though it is. It's limited by the fact that provincial governments have to sign on. So I don't know whether Mr. Kenney intends to sign on. I have my doubts. But this would be a very important program enabling women who've been pushed out of the workforce over the last 17 months to be able to go back to work. And it would cut the cost of childcare across the country in half. And for those of you who have small children, you will know that the cost of childcare in Alberta at this point is pegged at $6,300. So if the national childcare program that is being discussed was implemented, next year the tuition would be cut in half. And by 2026, it would be cut in half again. And what we are proposing is it should be free. And that would enable working class families to be able to go to work and know that their kids are safe and in safe hands while they are working. And it would enable women to go to work. And I don't know how many of you have children. I know at least one who has a couple of little kids in childcare. But, you know, you can be spending in Ontario over $20,000 a year if you have small children. It's you know, when you have more than one child or two children, that's it. You stay home. You don't work anymore because you can't afford to go to work. You're working for nothing. And surely we have reached the point where we can deliver, as they have already in Quebec, a national public child care program that is public, that is quality, and that is free, we say, for users. So these are the kinds of things that we need to do to put the country back to work and to raise living standards. I didn't say anything about climate change, and I think it's pretty important to say something about that because our slogan is that we have to put people and nature and the environment before profits. And of course, that's not anywhere in the cards, anywhere in Canada, especially not here. We just saw some figures from the federal government again, showing that in the years between 2016 and the present, 2016 is when they Canada signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement. There have been no emission reductions in Canada. In fact, emissions have risen in Canada during that period. And the plan for emission reduction from the Liberal government during that period, because that was all Liberal government time, was to put a price on emissions. And the proposal from the Liberals this time around is to increase the price of emissions so that it will be a higher price. But where's the logic in that? If the initial proposal to put a price on emission hasn't resulted in any reductions, and in fact has seen increases in emissions, why would we think that increasing the price of emissions is going to make any difference at all going forward? Yet everybody knows, especially after this summer, that action on climate change is really essential. It's very important. And that if we don't act now, we could find ourselves in a situation where we are well over the best before date. We're well over the date where it is reasonable to think that we can halt or reverse emissions below the figures that have been stated by the scientists to be essential for us to do that. I should tell you that the elephant in the room, if you will, the big problem in the room, in terms of what action we should take to really see some substantial reductions in emissions and carbon emissions, is the oil and gas companies. That's the big problem. They're the ones who are blocking any kind of action, opposing any kind of action, and of course, those are the companies which stand solidly behind the Conservative Party and also the Liberal Party. And it's pretty clear that in order to get some real action on climate change, we need to move those multinational corporations off the stage. We say it's time to nationalize energy in this country and to move from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. So we're talking about solar, we're talking about thermal, we're talking about wind, and to some degree also we're talking about hydro. And there will be new sources of renewable energy developed as well as we move forward once we totally commit to the development of renewable energy. And this should be done within the framework of a publicly owned and democratically controlled system of energy in this country. And we know that there are a lot of workers across Canada, in Alberta, but not only here, a lot of workers who come to Alberta to work in the energy industry. And why do they do that? Well, mainly because there's no jobs, and there's no other jobs to work in. That's why they work in those industries. But they have, like everybody else, families to feed. And the solution here is for the federal government to guarantee the jobs and the wages of workers in the fossil fuel industries who will be displaced by this shift from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. That's the way to do it. And as I'm sure many of you know, because you live here and you study this stuff all the time, that fossil fuel energy is capital intensive and renewables are labor intensive, which means there are going to be a whole lot more jobs in the renewable energy than there are in the fossil fuel industry. And so we are looking at a job creation proposal. And we think that many Canadians will agree that this would make a decisive change. And there's another piece here too that isn't discussed very much, and that is to how do we reduce, apart from the fossil fuel industries, how do we reduce carbon emissions? And you know, the biggest producers of carbon emissions in the country is the military. And if we were to cut the military budget by 75%, which we think is a good idea because we need that money for socially useful purposes instead of for wars and regime change and militarizing space and all the rest of it, we could substantially cut emissions reductions, and we could substantially cut emissions, carbon emissions, as well if we did that. So we want to try to raise this issue so that people can understand in the course of the election that emissions reductions and military spending are connected, and that we need an independent Canadian foreign policy of peace with a much smaller military budget, not only for the purposes of peace and of a different kind of foreign policy in Canada, but also from the point of view of reducing carbon emissions and doing something substantial about climate change. So we have been following the bulletin of the atomic scientists. Some of you may know about this bulletin. The atomic scientists came together to start talking about peace and the danger of nuclear weapons and nuclear war right after 1945, when the first nuclear weapons were set off by the United States and Japan. And they have this clock, which midnight means Armageddon, the end of the world. And they keep changing the time on the clock to indicate the level of danger that the world is facing from nuclear weapons. But they've now expanded that to say it's nuclear weapons, but it's also the environmental crisis that together have brought us to 90 seconds to midnight. They used to talk about minutes. Well, first they talked about hours, then they talked about minutes, now it's 90 seconds to midnight. So these questions are not just issues of policy, well, we could do this, or we could do that, or we could do something else. So they're issues about survival. Survival of the planet, survival of the world's people, and also the question of what kind of survival. So what I want to say to you today is that the Conservatives are coming out with policies that they want to trick working people with. And you can see how they are active in the anti-vaxxing community, if you can call it that community, and that movement, that really violent, angry movement of people. This is to try and convince people that the difficult situation that people are facing with jobs, with the environment, with social programs, the living standards, etc., are all caused by the Liberal Party. And I'm not here to tell you that the Liberal Party didn't cause them. They did, but so did the Tories. These are the parties of big business, and these are the parties which introduced these policies and brought us to the situation that we are facing now in this crisis. But they did it because they're both capitalist parties. This is capitalism. This is the logical conclusion and end of the story of capitalism, if you will. This is where boom bust takes us. And in the era of climate change and of growing threats of war and militarism and economic crisis, this is where it takes us. So as I said earlier, we think the greatest danger would be a Tory minority government or majority government. But this is not to say that the solution then is strategic voting and please go and vote for the NDP or for the Liberals. That's not a solution in our view. We're saying to people, if you like what you've been getting over the last 2 years or the last 6 years, keep voting the way you're voting. But if you think there's something fundamentally wrong with this picture, and that there's a better way along the lines that we've set out here in our policy, put the country back to work, a foreign policy of peace and disarmament, rising living standards, rising wages for people who aren't working, to be able to have a guaranteed annual livable income. If you can't work, you still have a right to live in some kind of, quality of life. If you're a pensioner, you have a right to live on a pension. With the Canada Pension Plan, the maximum payout is $1,100. We can't even rent an apartment for $1,100, let alone live on it. If you think that if you're unemployed and can't find work, that you have right to employment insurance that's more than $300 or $400 a week and expires, in under a year when we are facing permanent long-term unemployment, then you need to look at the kinds of solutions that we are offering here. These are real solutions. They're not socialism, but they certainly address the immediate problems that many, many working people are facing, and many more are going to be facing before too long. And don't vote for your own interests in this election. Don't vote strategically, or for God's sake, don't vote for the big business parties, but vote for policies that reflect your interests. And if you do that, the smaller parties in Parliament and the big parties too will take notice, and they'll say, people people want these kinds of policies. We'd better do something in order to save our system and make some concessions. So we are Canada's Party of Socialism, and we make no bones about the fact that socialism is the way to solve the problems that working people are facing in the long term. But in the immediate term, these are the immediate solutions that we can offer and that we think that can be achieved. And we also think that it's unlikely that we're going to get the kind of outcome that we hope for and that we're advocating on September 21st. So we are going to be here on the 21st, and we are going to be continuing to fight for the kinds of policies that I've outlined here, and that take a look at our program. You'll see there's a lot more in there. And it's going to take the building of a people's coalition, a powerful force that can force governments to change direction and policies, and that can also bring about the election of more progressive political options that are currently on the agenda. It's time that communists were elected. We have elected communists in this country in the past, and they have made a big difference in terms of the direction of the country and the policies that were raised. And I'll just give you one example. Unemployment insurance. It was won by the Communist Party and the On to Ottawa trek, led by communists like Slim Evans and others. And I won't kid you folks, we're going to have to fight for this. You know, you get on election day what you fought for and what you've achieved before the election. And that's why we need to build up the kind of coalition that could put forward candidates, including communist candidates, that can be elected and can bring about the kinds of policies that are so urgently needed today. And we know that one of the reasons that people are so angry, you know, I'm not talking about the wild anti-vaxxers and people who are so, you know, who are chasing Trudeau. This is a political movement a la Donald Trump. I'm talking about working people who are at the end of their tether. They don't know where to go. They don't know what's next. And they're angry. They're bloody angry. And we are seeing some of those people coming to us. And we're seeing a lot more of them who are demanding, you know, that there needs to be fundamental change in this country. And that's what we are offering. And so on that note, I'll just leave you with one story, which you might find appealing. I did. We've had a little bit of media attention that we don't usually get during federal elections, but we did get some, and it started out with CBC covering a story in Hamilton, Ontario, and it was about the fact that the Communist Party Club in Hamilton had grown substantially, very large, relative to what CBC, I guess, thought it should be. So they phoned us and they said, is it true that the Communist Party in Hamilton has, you know, experienced large growth? Yes, I said, that's true. They said, well, is it just in Hamilton or in other places too? Well, I said, I'm afraid it's across the whole country. Oh, they said, well, how big is the Communist Party? Well, I said, we don't release numbers, our membership numbers, but I can tell you that our party has grown by more than 50% in the last little bit more than a year. Oh my, she said. What do you think the reason is? Well, I said, I think it's got something to do with capitalism. Okay, she said. So it's about capitalism and the kind of fundamental change that we really need in this country, that we are fighting for and will continue to fight for through this election campaign and afterwards. And we are getting bigger, we're getting stronger, and that's a good thing, because a strong Communist Party means a strong left, and a strong left means a strong progressive movement, and it means progress on the kind of fundamental change that we so desperately need in this country. Thank you. Sure, yeah. Our growth. the growth levels, and the fact that we are growing primarily amongst people in their 20s and 30s. There are also older people and some younger, but many of them are workers. Some are students, and these are all serious people who are, joining the Communist Party. Some of them have experience in other political parties. Some of them are just deciding they need to get political. They've read our program. They've seen our policies for people's recovery, which are the policies that I've talked about in our program here. And they've decided that the Communist Party, Canada's Party of Socialism, is the party that can take them where they want to go, that can build a kind of movement that can, achieve the kind of change that people are looking for. So we are very happy to have serious people joining the party, and for the reasons that I gave. A strong Communist Party means a strong left, and boy, do we need a strong left in this country today. The second question we have here has to do with nuclear energy, and person asking. Sure. So the question is about our Communist Party's stance on nuclear energy. So we think that, first of all, Canada is a very energy-rich country, and we are not in a position, as some countries are, where nuclear energy is the only option. We have lots of options here, and in particular around renewables. So we want to see the phasing out of nuclear energy because we have options. We're not dependent on that, and we want to see Canada's energy industry under public and democratic control, so that it can be developed in the interests of the people who live and work in this country, as opposed to the big multinational corporations, which are, making a fortune out of the development of fossil fuels. This is an area where we also disagree with the Green Party, which never talks about the development of renewables from the perspective of a publicly owned industry. And they see it apparently more as business opportunities for small businesses. But we don't see it that way. We're not interested in, developing for-profit energy sector in Canada. We'd be much better off with a publicly owned system that can be democratically controlled by Parliament. But the question is about tax. So, and I didn't speak about that. I'm sorry. I think I should have. So you mentioned in particular the banks and the insurance companies. These are the most profitable corporations in the country. We don't want to increase the taxes. We want to nationalize those companies. These are companies which, well, as I said, they're hugely profitable. They exploit Canadian workers and the Canadian public, and we should just take them over. This would also help to reduce the power of big corporations. If we, reduce their if we nationalize the banks and insurance companies, then that's an important thing too, curbing the power of the monopolies of the big corporations. You were also asking about our tax policy in general. So we want to see a progressive, a system of progressive taxation enacted in Canada. It used to be, the system here used to be much more progressive than it is today. I remember in the 1970s, we could say that 50 cents of every dollar raised, tax dollar raised, 50 cents came from corporations and 50 cents came from individuals, people like us. Well, that's long gone. And it's more than 90 cents of every tax dollar comes from individuals, and much less comes from corporations. So we want to start by doubling the corporate tax rate, which has fallen and fallen and fallen. In the post-war period, it used to be very high. And you will see inside our folder here, there's a little chart showing how much it has fallen. Even in the last 30 years, it's fallen by more than 30%. So let's start by doubling it. We also want to see the capital tax restored. We want to see capital gains tax. This is a bit complicated, but anyways, capital gains should be taxed at 100% of the gain. So not just 50%, or what the NDP has announced today, that they support 75% tax on capital gains, but that they should pay 100%, they should pay the whole tax on a gain. We also want to see wealth and inheritance taxes introduced. The NDP has been talking about wealth taxes, but we think they are very modest proposals that they are making. We have some of the richest corporate executives in the world live in Canada, and their corporations. Why should they pay so little? Why are we so modest? We think that they should pay a substantial amount of tax. How many houses can you live in? How many limousines can you drive? No, this dead pool of capital that they sit on should belong to the people of Canada. They shouldn't be able to accumulate such wealth while there is such poverty and unemployment in our country. It shouldn't be allowed, and we can address that with the tax policy, and we should do that. On estates, some people say, oh, you want to tax my estate? I'm going to leave my house to my kids, and you communists, you want to take it? No, we don't. We want to put a tax on estates over $2 million. And that, we think, will account for the high cost of housing in many cities across the country. So it's people who are really wealthy that we want to tax their estates, not regular working people. On the other side, we think that we need tax relief for working people who make less than $40,000 a year. We say they shouldn't pay any tax at all. And that for everybody else, we should be a steeply graduated system of taxation, so that the more that you make at the top end, the more you should pay. And the less you make on the bottom end, the less you should pay, and pay nothing at all at $40,000. We also want to see sales tax, the GST and the HST abolished. This is a user fee, and there's no reason for that. It's just another way to milk working people, and there's no reason to do it. So we should stop doing it. Does that answer your question? Well, we want to see, yeah, sure. So the question is about racism and discrimination, and we are calling for, accelerated action against organizations and individuals who are, undertake racist actions. So we could think about groups like the fascist organizations, which have been active in Canada, for a long time, but particularly since the Trump administration, they've been able to get away with a lot. So we want the existing laws that you referred to be enforced, and they often are not enforced. We also want organizations like the Proud Boys or the Ku Klux Klan or the One Percenters to be recognized in law as criminal organizations. And the federal government has added these groups, or they've referred to them in general, to the list of terrorist organizations. We don't think that's a good idea, because the list of terrorist organizations it's a political list. And these people are these are criminal organizations that they attack people, they hurt people. We've all seen what the crimes that Islamophobic crimes, the murder of 4 members of a family in London recently, the murder of in Saint-Croix, Quebec, of Muslims at prayer and so forth. Of course, going back to what happened in Quebec in the 1970s with the murder of the women at the university there because they were women. So these are criminal activities, and they should be treated as such. And they should also be enforced. So this is a different thing from criminalizing dissent, by the way. And by this, I want to differentiate the BDS movement, for example, that has been very active on university campuses across the country. And suddenly there is enormous enforcement against the people who are pro-Palestinian, who speak up in favor of the rights of the Palestinians and condemn Israel for its genocidal attacks on the Palestinians. So these people are being attacked by universities and by provincial governments, which have declared these actions to be illegal, unacceptable. But this has to do with free speech and the right to dissent. It's a different thing. I'm not sure I heard exactly what you said. You're asking about our position on Indigenous issues? Yes. Yes, sure. On Indigenous land issues, yeah. So this is an important question. We see that this has to do with the founding of Canada and the fact that the fairy stories that is churned out every July 1st about how Canada was, founded by colonial powers that were here to help Indigenous peoples and all that. It's just rubbish. And in fact, Canada was formed at the point of a gun, first by the genocide against and forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples by European colonial powers. And secondly, by the defeat of the French colonialists by the British after the 7 Years' War, at which time the wealthy French, who were living mostly in Quebec, but some in Nova Scotia at the time, were expelled, forced out of the country. The Acadians were. And the French who had money departed, and the only people who were left, French, were working stiffs who had no money, no way to get out. And so these are oppressed people. The Indigenous people have been oppressed, and the subjects of genocide, as we all know about the residential schools and the continuing crimes against Indigenous peoples, the the underfunding of education, of social programs, the very high death rates, the high suicide rates amongst Indigenous youth on reserve, etc. So the question then is, what are we going to do about it? And we think that the fundamental problem that I've described has a solution, and the solution is to recognize the national composition or the national characteristic of this country. It is not just an English-speaking country, it is a multinational state. Indigenous peoples and nations are part of it. The Acadians and Quebec are part of it, and English-speaking Canada, the rest of the country is also part of it. So we say what we need is a new, equal, and voluntary partnership of all of those nations. And that this would be achieved through negotiations of all of the partners, and it would be based on the basis of the right of each to national self-determination, including the right to separation, to secession. And I'd like to say that because, as in the case, for example, of women's equality, we support the right of women to divorce, as do most people at this late stage in history. But that doesn't mean we are advocating that all women should get divorced. Right? It means that the right to divorce means that women have the right to negotiate the terms on which they will continue a partnership, a marriage. What are the terms of the marriage? Will you have equality or will you not have equality? And this is the same right which nations have to have within Canada. So that's the fundamental change that we see. Whether all of those partners will want to be part of a new equal voluntary partnership, we don't know. We'll find out when we start negotiating what those terms might be. But we think the alternative is not a very good one, because the U.S. has been since their revolution, they've been trying to take over Canada, and that hasn't changed. And if Canada were to split up into different states, it would be much easier for U.S. imperialism to overtake those states. However, it's up to each of the partners to decide how they want to proceed. We think that some of the important things that have to be done right now, and as part of on the road to that kind of a solution, would be to recognize the land rights of Indigenous people. Indigenous people and land are they go together, and we have to. UNDRIP is very important. For example, UNDRIP legislation, international legislation, which guarantees the free, prior, and informed consent of any development on or near Indigenous land, must have the consent of Indigenous people. They have the right to veto. In fact, they do have the right to veto, and this is essential. We also want to see urgent action to negotiate the land claims, Indigenous land claims, and that these should be that the recognition and resolution of those resolution of those land claims does not eliminate inherent land rights. So we're talking here about unceded land and the right, a right of Indigenous peoples to claim that land and to expect compensation, negotiations, etc., with respect to that land. And we also think that it is outrageous that the Canadian government still has not been able to deliver clean drinking water and housing, which is not, falling apart on reserves, and education, which is equitable to the education which is offered to non-Indigenous children across the country. Probably everyone here knows, I assume you do, that the funding from the federal government for education and social services for Indigenous children is less than that which is available to non-Indigenous children, and that is why the Indigenous people have taken the federal government to court several times, and to the Human Rights Commission several times, and on each occasion the courts have sided with Indigenous people, and yet the government continues to challenge and to appeal and so forth. This has to stop, and there has to be urgent action to improve the lifestyle, the lives and living conditions of Indigenous people on reserve, and also living off reserve in Canada. These are basic human rights. The key thing here is the recognition of the right to self-determination, and everything flows from that. Okay, so let me say that what I was trying to say is that we recognize Indigenous sovereignty, we defend Indigenous sovereignty, we fight for Indigenous sovereignty, we support the land back, we support the Wet'suwet'en people. The struggle that is underway there, not only on behalf of Indigenous sovereignty, but they are actually there fighting for, for climate justice for all people. So we think that there is a very clear bond of unity between Indigenous peoples and people who are like ourselves and who are looking for, justice. For Indigenous people and justice for working people of this country. We say, as I said, for people's recovery, for people and putting people and the planet before profits, and that means recognizing Indigenous rights and supporting them, actively supporting them. I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay, yeah. Well, we think that we've been campaigning for many years. So the question was about how do we propose to stop corporations with operations in Canada who want to depart because there are countries nearby, say the U.S., with lower tax rates. And so the answer is we've been campaigning for many years for plant closure legislation. Which would forbid corporations from closing up their operations, whether it's a plant that's producing cars or other equipment, or whether it's financial operations or technical, whatever it is, that they would have to appear before a public tribunal to justify their proposals for departing. So if they said, for example, because we could pay lower wages, which is what they can do under the free trade agreement, or because we can get lower tax rates in Mexico or the U.S., which is what they can do under the free trade agreement, we would say that those are not good reasons for packing up your operations. If you want to leave, you can leave, but your plant and your capital in that investment in that plant, in those operations, stay in Canada, and the Canadian government would take them over. Public tribunals would also have the power to, would also have legal powers to fine corporations or jail executives. So we're talking about, major efforts here to stop corporations from being able to do that. You said specifically taxes, but I gave an answer that is about more than taxation, but it would certainly include taxation. We don't think that this has to do with sovereignty, and this has to do with these international trade agreements, free trade agreements, which are undermining the ability of nation states like Canada to be able to make decisions about what is in the best interest of the people of, in this case, Canada, of our country. And it's not in the best interest of our country for big corporations to depart because they can pay lower taxes somewhere else. It's not. It should be illegal. And that's our answer. It should stop and it should be illegal. And it's just common sense. Otherwise, other countries are going to be, other governments will be determining what are the rules of the Canadian economy, and that's we've seen that already with free trade deals, in particular, which have lost hundreds of plants and factories that were involved in manufacturing and secondary industry, which should just put their operations on skids and left. We used to have a appliance industry in Canada. Well, we don't anymore. It's not in Canada. It's gone south. We used to have the agricultural implements industry. Well, we don't anymore. It's gone south. We used to build ships in this country. Well, we don't anymore. We had a system, a very good system for protecting farmers, small farmers. And this is now under attack as a result of CETA and also the USMCA free trade deal with the United States. So this is not good. So we should get out of those free trade deals, which are harming our economy, harming our ability to make the decisions that over how we want our country to work, and are destroying a lot of jobs. Bad. And these decisions are not being made by Canadian governments. They're being made by these supranational, mostly corporate bodies. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming out tonight, and thank you for your questions. And we have a world to win and an election to win as well. Let's make sure that minority government is the best outcome, and a strong progressive bloc with as many progressive people as we could see elected will be the best outcome, and the struggle will continue after the 20th. Thank you.
I'd just like to say one more thing, is that because of pandemic conditions, we're not offering you any cookies or treats of that sort. And I'm sorry about that. I wish that we could, but that we will hope that, when this pandemic is finally resolved, it'll be long enough before the next one that we'll have time to also get together over food and drink. But in the meantime, I do thank everyone who has come here tonight. We thank all those who joined us online as well. And if you have want further information or would like to ask further questions, I could refer you to the Communist Party website for the Communist Party of Canada, and also votecommunist.com, which is our election platform website, where you'll find information about the various candidates and more information about various aspects of our party program and platform. So, and also you will find on those websites the possibility to make donations to the party, which, whether it's an election period or not, are actually very generously refunded in the form of tax receipts, which can be used on your next year's tax return for anyone who is in the tax-paying income bracket. So we would be very happy to receive donations, either in the form of checks to the Communist Party or through our online donation apps that you will find on both those websites. So thank you very much once again for your attention and for your ongoing support as we go on, building progressive movements and building alliances to make a better Canada. Thank you.